An elderly woman was denied a seat in first class. Passengers glanced at her with disapproving looks, while the flight attendant motioned for her to move to the back. No one knew she was the mother of the airline CEO. What happened next left everyone speechless. Watch until the end for a powerful lesson, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. The sky was darkening as an elderly woman slowly stepped into the luxurious airplane cabin. Her frail frame contrasted sharply with the opulence around her, plush leather seats, soft ambient lighting, and the faint scent of expensive perfume lingering in the air. In her trembling hands, she clutched a first-class ticket. She double-checked the seat number, making sure she was in the right place. Carefully, she made her way toward her assigned seat. But before she could sit down, a sharp voice stopped her. "Ma'am, you can't sit here." A flight attendant stood in front of her, young and beautiful but with a cold, assessing gaze, one that silently questioned why someone like this elderly woman would be in first class. The old woman paused, offering a gentle smile as she held out her ticket with her wrinkled hand. "I'm sorry, dear, but this is my seat." The flight attendant snatched the ticket without a hint of courtesy. Her eyes scanned the details, and for a brief moment, her brows furrowed, perhaps in surprise. But she quickly masked it with a condescending smirk. "Are you sure this is your ticket?" she asked, her tone dripping with disbelief. The elderly woman nodded. "Yes, dear. I bought it some time ago." The flight attendant sighed before letting out a soft chuckle, as if she had just heard something absurd. She turned to a colleague nearby and whispered, loud enough for both the old woman and a few passengers to hear. "This must be a system error. Someone like her in first class? Impossible." A few passengers glanced over. A middle-aged man shook his head. A young woman near the window exchanged whispers with her friend before both of them let out quiet giggles. No one spoke up. No one questioned it. The elderly woman simply stood there, silent, not with anger, but with the quiet understanding of someone who had seen the world judge people based on appearances too many times before. The flight attendant crossed her arms. "First class is reserved for passengers of a certain status, ma'am." The woman's soft smile faded slightly. "Do I not look like someone who belongs here?" The attendant smirked. "I never said that. But you can see for yourself, first class has its standards." The elderly woman glanced around. Every set of eyes was on her. No one said a word, but their looks were enough of an answer. She took a deep breath, then smiled faintly, not out of happiness, but because she knew arguing would be pointless. "So, because I dress simply, you assume I don't belong?" she asked, her voice calm but firm. The flight attendant straightened. "I'm just following procedure, ma'am. Please come with me. We'll find you a more suitable seat." Silence. The elderly woman looked at the seat she had paid for. She wanted to protest, but she knew it wouldn't change anything. With even slower steps than before, she let herself be led down the aisle, away from the place that was rightfully hers. As she passed the first-class passengers, not one of them intervened. Not one of them asked if this was a mistake. She simply walked, growing smaller in the distance. The flight went on as usual. When the plane finally landed, passengers began gathering their belongings, ready to disembark. The elderly woman sat quietly in her economy seat, gazing out the window. Then, suddenly, hurried footsteps echoed through the cabin. A well-dressed man in a tailored suit, his hair neatly styled, strode onto the plane, his face filled with concern. He was not a passenger, his presence carried authority. The flight attendants, who had earlier been so dismissive, now looked tense, exchanging nervous glances. The man stopped near the first-class section, scanning the cabin frantically. Then, his eyes landed on her, the frail elderly woman, sitting quietly in economy. In an instant, his face changed. Without hesitation, he rushed toward her, almost running. "Mother! What happened?" His voice was laced with worry. The entire cabin fell silent. Passengers who had ignored the situation now watched, eyes wide. The crew, especially the flight attendant who had dismissed her, turned pale. The elderly woman looked up at her son, her calm expression unchanged. But instead of complaining or breaking down, she simply smiled and shook her head. "It's all right, son. I'm fine." Her son's eyes hardened. He turned to the flight crew, his expression now ice-cold. "Who was in charge of this flight?" His voice was dangerously low. No one answered immediately. The flight attendant who had treated his mother poorly lowered her head, visibly trembling. "I asked a question. Who is responsible?" His tone sharpened. A male attendant hesitantly stepped forward, his voice shaky. "Yes, sir, you are? The CEO of this airline." His words were final. The cabin froze. Some passengers gasped. The flight attendant who had mocked the elderly woman looked as if all the color had drained from her face. The CEO took a deep breath, controlling his anger. I want a full report on what happened. Immediately. His gaze was sharp, leaving no room for excuses. There was no escape now. And for those who had judged her unfairly, they knew this mistake would not be forgotten. The next day, the incident made headlines. Not just within the airline but across social media and global news. People were stunned to learn that the humble elderly woman was the mother of the airline's CEO, and even more shocked by how she had been treated simply because of her appearance. But what truly caught attention was the CEO's response. That morning, the airline released an official statement. Every crew member involved in the incident, including the flight attendant who had turned her away, was immediately dismissed. No warnings. No second chances. Beyond that, the CEO implemented a new policy. Every employee, from ground staff to cabin crew, would undergo retraining on customer service ethics, ensuring every passenger was treated with respect, regardless of status or appearance. There is no place in this airline for those who judge others by their looks, the CEO stated firmly. Every passenger deserves equal respect, because a person's worth is not measured by their clothing but by the way they treat others. The story quickly went viral. Thousands shared it, reflecting on how often society judges based on appearances. Many were deeply moved by the elderly woman's grace. She never raised her voice, never demanded special treatment, and remained kind despite the injustice she faced. Amid all the discussions, one quote stood out the most. "A person doesn't need to look rich to deserve respect. What truly defines us is not what we wear, but how we treat others." And for those who witnessed this firsthand, it was a lesson they would never forget.